You are listening to the IoT For All Media Network.
One thing I wanted to ask if you guys could expand on, and maybe I could throw it over to Calum to talk about this, is when we talk about it from the customer perspective, there is this IoT journey that customers go on, right? From when they educate themselves and understand what the technology is, all the way through when they begin launching, and then eventually, hopefully, get to scale. Calum, from your experience working with different deployments and projects, what does that journey look like for customers? And you can tie that in obviously to what Eric was talking about of what the solution journey is like as well. But I know they kind of tie hand in hand a little bit there with going from the ideation phase all the way to scale. But if you could talk and break that down a little bit, I think that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah, and this is a core part of the IoT playbook Eric mentioned earlier, and that we're going to be sharing freely for people to access because we want to make this knowledge accessible. And it really is important to think through this in a structured approach. So we think of there being 5 steps to the IoT solution journey that we call it. And those steps are select a use case, validate, typically with a proof of concept or an MVP. Validate, is there something actually here before we invest further? Pilot it, actually get in the real world with real sensors and start finding out what are some of those considerations you can plan for.
Right.
Launch it, going from a pilot to a larger deployment typically requires some, there might be some additional things you need to change or features to add or things like that you learn during the pilot as part of launching. And then finally scale. How do you operate this thing at scale with hundreds of thousands, millions of devices? Hopefully, if you're selling this, tons of customers, bringing you revenue, how do you do that? And so you might wonder, all right, that's 5 steps. Why did Eric just describe 3 when it's the leverage view? And that's because our business from a technology perspective, we have aligned it around these steps to enable each one to be successful. So
right.
For example, with going from pilot to launch, you don't want to have to rebuild everything. And we've seen this with some other companies on the market where they are really good at doing the proof of concept or the pilot, but then there's this huge gap between going to scale. And the way we've architected things is it's the exact same software. And it's aimed at being able to do each of these well. So really quickly able to build an MVP so you can validate the use case, and on that same software stack, being able to go to scale. You don't need to say, all right, we proved it. Now we need to rebuild everything or find a different software platform. But the reason it's not, Eric described 3 and I just described 5 is, for this first step, selecting a use case, from a technology perspective, we can't choose the use case for you. What we can do is help with how to think about selecting a use case. And this is where the IoT playbook comes in. So a lot of this is aimed at companies that are saying, all right, we want to build an IoT solution. Whether that is an entrepreneur within a larger enterprise that is trying to build a new business line, or a startup, an entrepreneur that is building a company around a product or something they see in the market. In both cases, though, you need to decide, what are we tackling here? What is the problem we're trying to solve? And that's really dependent on the company. So for the larger companies, selecting a use case, you should look at, what is your existing customer base? If you're a very large enterprise, we work with a lot of telecoms in the world. They already have relationships with many different businesses. And so that's a big strength of theirs that they should leverage. And say, okay, well, we already have a ton of customers in manufacturing. What problems do they have that we might be able to go solve? Because you already have the distribution, you already have the relationship. So all you need to focus on is building the right solution that'll solve their needs and they'll be willing to pay for. On the entrepreneurship side, we have both customers at both ends of the spectrum. Eric mentioned earlier, Siren Marine. They're a startup built on top of our stack. We have some other startups as well. And for them, typically what they're bringing is very deep industry specific experience. It could be in boating. It could be in the medical space. And they see a problem that they're like, hey, there's a product here. There's a company here that can be built around this.
Right.
So in general, this first step, select your use case. Things to think about are, what are the real problems here? How much would customers be willing to pay? One way you can work back from that is if you're saving them costs, then presumably they'd be willing to pay at least that much. So if you can save a company $1 million, it should be worth somewhere around maybe a little less than $1 million, because then there's a delta of how much you're saving them. That could be one way to think about it. But fundamentally, you want to identify, where can I provide real value, and where is an area in which me or we uniquely as a business have an opportunity here, whether because we have existing relationships or we uniquely see a problem because of our industry knowledge in this area. So that's step 1. Again, the IoT playbook helps with how to think about this.
Sure.
But from a technical perspective, no matter how good we make our application development software, we can't choose your use case for you. Once you've selected a use case, however, what we can help you with is the second stage, which is validate. So the reason we have, if I can just pause for a second and zoom out, the reason we advocate for this journey with these distinct steps is to solve some of those challenges I mentioned before. So if you're trying to make these trade-offs between the technical considerations, the operational considerations, the financial considerations, but they're all interconnected, how do you plan that in advance? Well, the answer is you can't. You can't know this in advance. You can make guesses, and you should certainly do some back of the envelope calculations and have a general idea that there's something here. But a lot of this you only find out once you actually put it in the real world. What are some of the operational considerations? Well, how do you find that out if some of those operations are your customer? You don't have full visibility into that until you actually start working with them and deploying and find out, oh, wow, here's a challenge we could not have planned for. So this can be really scary, especially for larger companies, because they don't want to waste money on just throw a bunch of good money after bad. And so they want to plan. They want to say, okay, well, if we're going to invest in this thing, we want to make sure that there's a return on investment for us, which is completely reasonable for them to think that. The challenge is you can't know some of that in advance. So how do you square the circle here? How do you find a solution to minimize risk so that you don't throw a bunch of money at something only to find out it doesn't work, while also recognizing the reality that some of the stuff you can't find out that by taking these steps. So the design of this journey is meant to enable companies to get maximum learnings for the lowest investment and risk, which ultimately de-risks it. So the validate stage, I zoomed out, I'm zooming back in. You select the use case, you think, all right, there's something here. The validate stage, you want to really quickly build an MVP or a proof of concept. Our stack, once again, is aimed at helping with exactly this, where there's a lot of no-code configuration abilities to very quickly build an application. You can even use simulated data, so you don't have to integrate devices yet. So you can actually put it in front of potential customers and say, what do you think of this thing? This can enable you to validate the use case before you invest in going out and buying devices and integrating them, running a pilot, which has expenses for it. So you're getting a lot of learnings for minimal investment by validating the use case with a proof of concept or MVP. You can use either term. The third step, pilot. So at this stage, you say, okay, we validated it. We got some good customer input. They're really excited. They said, this looks great. And now we need to figure out, all right, what are some of the real costs operationally, financially? What are the right devices for this thing? This is where a pilot comes in. If you are the one building and selling solutions, ideally you want your customer to pay for the pilot if you're selling into an enterprise, because then they have some skin in the game. If you just do it for free, they might say, oh, this looks cool, but then it just dies and doesn't go anywhere. So ideally you get them to have some payment for it. Now they'll be more invested, literally, in the solution. But you actually want to deploy it in the real world, because this is where you can generate some of those learnings of what are the true costs? What are the true trade-offs? You might choose a device that you use in the pilot, and you might prove there's value. And the customer says, I'm willing to pay for this. But as you go through the pilot, you realize this isn't the right device for whatever reason. We actually need a different way of getting location or connectivity for the device, or there's some operational considerations that come up that you just need to address. So once again, the goal of this pilot in this third step is maximum learnings, minimal investment to de-risk it. So now you finish the pilot, the customer says, this is amazing. We want to take this to scale. There's a real business case here. And you've gained a lot of learnings. Now you can evaluate, is it worth launching this? And sometimes it might not. You should feel comfortable as an organization deciding this isn't worth it. We've gone through this, and this is actually is much more expensive or operationally intensive than we imagined at first. Cut it. That's the point of taking these steps. So you don't waste a bunch of money. You can pursue the real opportunities. But let's say that there's a there's a real opportunity. Now it's time to launch. This is where you'll typically start ramping up a lot of your internal teams. You can keep your teams pretty lean going through these phases, especially because, once again, our Leverege IT stack helps with reducing a lot of the costs and speeding up this development.
Right.
But if you're launching this, you need to have operational teams, sales, marketing, if you're really taking this to market. So that's where you might start actively hiring up to support this, building some additional features you might notice. Perhaps for this one customer you piloted, they're happy, but you want to sell this to multiple customers. And so you might need to build some features that are make this more generically or generally appealing to more companies so you can have a true product. So there's some additional development needed. Maybe you need to choose different devices because you learned in the pilot you didn't have the right ones. But fundamentally, what you're doing is gearing up to really launch this thing.
Right.
That's step 4, launch. And then step 5 is scale. So this is where you're figured it out. You have the right solution, and you're just adding new customers and supporting them. And there's still a lot involved there. You know, how do you sell new customers? The contracting. How do you deploy to them? How do you collect money so you can actually make money on this IoT solution? And then how do you support it operationally so that 3 years, 5 years down the road, as these devices, maybe the batteries die, how do they get replaced? Who is doing the replacement?
Right.
Figuring out all those elements are part of scaling and managing the IoT solution. So once again, 5 steps as part of this IoT solution journey. There's select your use case, validate the use case, pilot it, launch it, and then scale. And by taking this approach, it enables you to have maximum learnings for minimal investment, which ultimately de-risks it. So you can make this trade-off between the recognition that you can't plan everything in advance, and you don't want to just throw money at something without an expectation that, hey, you know, we can make a return on our investment here.
Right.